let me introduce Hilary to speak for our last session. Hilary, I'm sure you all know, is the principal investigator on the project which sort of birthed this conference, which is called Science and Scripture in Christianity and Islam, which makes her my boss. She is an affiliated lecturer in the Faculty of Divinity at the university, as well as being Director of Studies for Theology and Religious Studies at Girton College. She wrote her PhD thesis at Cambridge on the subject of the Old Testament prophets examined in the light of contemporary environmental ethics. And this thesis has been turned into a book and published, and it's available in the bookshop to buy if you're quick after the end of the session. So without further ado, evolution, biology and the Bible.
Okay, this is quite a big topic, as probably all our topics have been, and I want to just go through a few aspects of it, think a little bit about James Hannan took us up to Darwin. I want to think about some of the responses to Darwin, move forward into the 20th century and highlight a couple of key issues to do with reading the Bible in the light of evolutionary biology. I want then to just touch a very little short while on what we mean when we talk about the theory of evolution, and address one or two errors and misconceptions that sometimes creep in, and then move much more closely into the text of the Bible itself and think how it relates to biology, and then finish with a few theological reflections. So let's, first of all, I've got just a couple of quotes that I got off websites when I was just preparing for this talk, and these are contemporary websites. And the first one says, "Is it possible to believe in evolution and still be a Christian? If being a Christian means believing that the Bible is the authentic, trustworthy Word of God and that Christ is our Creator and Saviour, the answer is no. One cannot believe these things and also believe in evolution as the explanation for the origin of life on Earth as we know it." Well, I have to say, if you take that definition, then I am no longer a Christian, and I think possibly a few others in this room would fall into that category. The other quote is from a website called the Clergy Letter Project, and this is an attempt to gather clergymen, priests in the Christian tradition together, and this letter says, "We, Christian clergy from many different traditions, believe that the timeless truths of the Bible and the discoveries of modern science may comfortably coexist. We believe that the theory of evolution is a foundational scientific truth, one that has stood up to rigorous scrutiny and upon which much of human knowledge and achievement rests. To reject this truth, or treat it as one theory among others, is to deliberately embrace scientific ignorance and transmit such ignorance to our children." And we'll come back to that thought later on. But first of all, let's think a little bit about the theory of evolution. And we know it as Charles Darwin's theory. In fact, it was actually at the same time as Darwin was about to publish his theory of evolution, Alfred Wallace, working in East Asia, had come up with exactly the same, or more or less exactly the same theory for explaining how life had developed. And actually there was a little bit of a race to see who could make it public first, and Darwin, in terms of public understanding, is the name that we associate with the theory of evolution, and we'll come to what exactly that is a bit later on. But I want to just highlight one or two responses to the origin of species. The first is the idea that it actually set off the conflict between science and religion. The idea that this origin of species was so horrendous to people, Christians, that it effectively kind of made a great schism between them. And I've called that a myth, because actually that's not quite the truth. Another famous event was a debate between a scientist called Thomas Huxley and the Bishop of Oxford over whether the theory of evolution, which Huxley supported, was credible with Christian faith. Another aspect is Darwin's religious views. We'll come to those as well. But the most important thing to remember is that the theory of evolution was broadly supported by many, many clergymen. So it wasn't that it was the church against Darwin. It was that there were some people that reacted against the theory, and there was a narrative of conflict created around that. But for a lot of people, this was entirely compatible with biblical Christian faith. So the conflict myth was perpetuated in 2 books that were published, one in the UK, the one on the right-hand side by Draper, and the one on the left-hand side, Andrew Dixon White. Actually, I think I got those the wrong way round. Andrew Dixon White in the UK and Draper in the US. You can see from the title of this one, A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology, that it's kind of setting out to sort of really hammer an issue home. And they both took things out of context and used a rhetorical narrative to supposedly prove that Darwinism was the final nail in the coffin of any sort of relationship that there could be between science and religion. And actually reading extracts of, I think it was Dixon White I was reading, it reminded me a little bit of the books by Dawkins in the modern world, that kind of rhetoric which has elements that you think, yeah, okay, fair enough, and then a kind of a rhetoric that jumps to conclusions and makes statements that you think, no, that's not true, that's not the right way to interpret the evidence. The debate between Thomas Henry Huxley and the Bishop of Oxford, he thought that actually he'd won the debate. There's little evidence to show that he did. But one of the issues with Huxley was he was a man with a chip on his shoulder, because he wasn't a member of the aristocracy. He didn't have sponsorship by the aristocracy, and in those days it was very difficult to get a job as a scientist if you were neither a clergyman nor sponsored by the church or sponsored by someone, a patron, someone with wealth. And he couldn't get a job, and he was very embittered by this, and he took incredibly against the church because of this. So this is a personal story of hurt and rejection and feeling aggrieved that fueled his own religious atheism, but it was an argument, a reaction against the church. But Darwin's supporters are many. This is Asa Gray saying, evolution may be as profoundly and particularly theistic as it is increasingly probable. The taint of atheism is not inherent in the original grain of Darwinism, in the principles posited. So he's trying to draw a distinction between views of Huxley as an atheist and those that say that's incompatible with faith. And this is a statement by someone who founded Princeton Theological Seminary and actually is kind of known for writing a very definitive book on the authority and inspiration of the Bible, which is kind of still you come across in some conservative seminaries. But he said, I do not think that there is any general statement in the Bible or any part of the account of creation that need to be opposed to evolution. And then just thinking a little bit about Darwin's faith, it is true that Darwin moved from being someone who regularly participated in the Church of England congregation which his family had gone to someone who moved towards a more agnostic position. But the argument that was because of the theory of evolution is slightly misplaced. The main factor in his loss of faith or his withdrawal from faith was that his daughter died aged 10 years of age, and he suffered a bit of a crisis of faith. So the idea that you may have heard that the theory of evolution was what scuppered Darwin's faith is not strictly accurate. And a lot of the analyses by historians of science of that period and the supposed conflict is summarized as being really a struggle between the traditional ways that natural philosophy or science was done by clergymen, sponsored by the church, and the way that science was developing in the 19th century, branching into different subdivisions, biology, zoology, chemistry and so on, and becoming more professionalized, professional scientific organizations starting. And so one historian of science says in the Victorian era, the metaphor of conflict had been promoted as part of the rhetoric by which new generation of professional scientists sought to establish themselves as a source of authority in an industrialized society. An alternative source of authority, you might say, to the church. Okay, let's move on a little bit to the 20th century. And I think there are two key times in the 20th century where you find, I suppose, the impetus towards biblical creationism. In other words, a strong emphasis on the idea that evolution is incompatible with the Bible, incompatible with the early chapters of Genesis. And the first of those is the Scopes trial, which took place in 1925 in Dayton, Tennessee. And Scopes was a high school teacher, biology teacher, who had taught from the textbook that was available to him that had stuff on evolution in it. He taught evolution, but the local powers that be decided that, in fact, they passed a law in the state saying that evolution should not be taught. So he was seen to have violated this law, forbidding teaching evolution in state schools in Tennessee. And he agreed to go on trial for this as a kind of a showcase, to be the defendant in this kind of, if you like, this wrangling between two sections of the society. So the campaign to ban Darwin from the school curriculums was enacted in this Scopes trial. It wasn't ever about him personally. It was a very highly staged, publicised media trial, lots of public attention, and they had to move out of the courtroom to hold it in the square because so many people wanted to come and hear. The prosecution lawyer, somebody called William Bryan, a very high profile person. He'd been a presidential candidate for 3 times in the past. And it's really interesting if you read some of the transcripts of the trial, because one of the aspects was a very extended cross-examination of Bryan by the defense lawyer, Darrow, about how he interpreted Genesis. And you see in it that there's a whole load of incoherence in those views under cross-examination. So he'd kind of had this idea that Genesis, you had to interpret it literally, but when he actually was unpacked, it was found that he didn't actually do that, but it was just in some places he did and some places he didn't. The outcome of the trial was that Scopes was found guilty and fined $100, but then that was overturned on a technicality. And interestingly, the prosecution lawyer, Bryan, died very suddenly 5 days later. And there's controversy now as to whether there's a causal link and what kind of causal link that is, and nobody really knows, so you can speculate on that. But the thing about the Scopes trial is this is not really about religion per se. It is a clash of values. It's a clash of traditional values that included religious ones with reformist, modernist attempts to kind of bring the world then into the modern world. It was very political, it was very fractious, it was a media circus, very much a kind of a, what shall I say, an example, trying to make an example of what was going on. And interestingly, as a result of it, arising from the Scopes trial is when you start to get the southern states of America referred to as the Bible Belt, and that kind of terminology comes in there as a result. And this is how Ed Larson, a historian of science, described it. The Scopes trial embodied the characteristically American struggle between individual liberty and majoritarian democracy, and cast it in the timeless debate over science and religion. And there's a cartoon published at the time. Sorry, did you get that? Oh, sorry. This is a group of monkeys. Man is not related to the monkey, says the placard. All those in favour. and the monkeys are all voting. And that was published in the Chicago Tribune at the time. So that was the journalists and cartoonists had a field day with that. Okay, and the second thing I want to think about is the rise of modern creationism, young Earth creationism in the United States. And really, young Earth creationism is really only on the map since about the 1980s onwards. You can argue when it sort of starts to come into the frame. Young Earth creationism basically equates evolution with atheism. So if you believe in evolution, you are an atheist. And the quote that I showed at the beginning suggested that the two are coterminous. But it's interesting, it's very, very much connected with the loss of traditional family values, secularization. So, for example, many of the young Earth creationists that are very vocal in the United States are also incredibly vocal on things like the abortion issue and supporting traditional family values. It's also highly politicized, as you know, you see that in things like election campaign and so on. And the Southern American Bible Belt is very right-wing, very Republican, to probably the surprise of many of us voted for a candidate in the election who is avowedly not Christian and doesn't subscribe to many of their values, but on certain things ticked the right box and was Republican and so on. Two examples of modern creationism are, one, and a key kind of founder, if you like, someone who's done a lot, is somebody called Ken Ham, who founded in 1995 an organization called Answers in Genesis. And Answers in Genesis basically argues that everything you need to know about the world can be found through a literal interpretation of Genesis and the Bible, and that anything else is atheist, evolutionary biology is atheistic. And then in 2007 he founded the Creation Museum, which is in Kentucky, thank you very much. And there you can go and you can see exhibitions of dinosaurs and people kind of in the same chronological time space. So Answers in Genesis is not only arguing against evolutionary biology, it's arguing for a young age of the Earth. So it's arguing against the kind of geological time frame and arguing that the Earth is only 6,000 years old. And this is one from their website. Learn how the Bible, the history book of the universe, provides the starting point for science. So they take, any science has to start from the Bible and go from there. So, and actually Caroline's written a really fascinating article which is yet to be published, we're waiting for a publisher, looking at the rhetoric of Ken Ham and how he uses digital media, Facebook, Twitter and so on, to kind of create a narrative that people buy into. In many ways not dissimilar to the way Trump uses that media. And also I think you've seen some comparisons with Haran Yahya's project in Turkey as well, that you create a sort of popular movement based on your rhetoric and your style of approach and so on. Okay, I want to move now to think about what is evolution. First of all, to say that the theory of evolution, what do we mean by theory? And that's something that people sometimes get muddled about. A theory in science is not a nice idea that you think might be true, but you haven't got any data to prove it. A theory is the end point when you have your data and you can postulate an explanation that makes sense of all that data. Okay, so a theory is not something that I don't know if it's true or not, but in science, it would be something that is the culmination of your research. You've done your research, you've got your data, you've studied the evidence, you've done empirical studies, and you reach this theory. So the word theory doesn't mean it's kind of, it's not quite sure if it's true or not. It means actually this is the best explanation we have for the data before us. And as I say this, I'm looking at my friend Cheryl because she is a scientist and she's nodding at me. So I think, and the theory of evolution is long established and developed over a period of time. And it seems to be a really accurate descriptor of the way life appears to have developed on our planet. It's supported by not just Darwin's observations, the fossil record, genetics. Darwin did comparative anatomy, behavioural biology. There's a lot of evidence that comes to support it. And of course, Darwin didn't have genetics to go on. He only had his own observations and those of others. But the genetic developments in the last 50, 60 years have actually supported much of what Darwin already established as the basics. But it's not the same as evolutionism. What do I mean by that? Evolutionism is like scientism. It's the idea that evolution or science explains everything there is to know about the world. So you can be an evolutionary biologist and be also an evolutionist, which says there is no other need for any other narrative. There's no need for a meta-narrative. Just as you can be a scientist and also scientistic, which says there is nothing needed but science. Dawkins is a classic example of that. If we're talking about evolutionary biology, the theory of evolution, we're not talking about a metaphysical position. We're talking about a biological, an explanation of how biological life works and has worked. And so I would suggest that evolutionary biology is compatible with faith. It doesn't exclude faith because it's not a metaphysical statement about reality. Okay, let's think a little bit more about how it works. And I'm indebted to my colleague Lizzie for her wonderful set of slides. And she goes into schools a lot, and I kind of liked her slides because they were really easy to understand. So evolution by natural selection tells us that small changes occur as living things reproduce, generation on generation. And some of those small changes are really useful for ensuring that you survive in a competitive world. And those changes are maybe that you've got slightly longer limbs, or you've got slightly sharper teeth, or whatever it is, are passed on to the next generation because you're the parent that survives. So if you have an inherent advantage because you're faster or stronger or whatever, you are the one that survive, and those that are weaker don't, because it's in the race for food and so on. So those small adaptive changes are passed on to the next generation, what biologists call selected for. And over time, those really small changes add up to big changes. Eventually, over thousands, millions of years, those changes lead to different species being formed. So if you trace back, all living species can go back to an ancestor that they had in common. We're related by common ancestors, but it's over a process of millions of years. And the more closely related living things are, the more similarity they show to one another. But the things that are not closely related obviously don't show the same similarities. And this is a rather crude diagram of all life on Earth, of biological classification. I put that up there because, broadly speaking, life is classified by scientists as bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. And you see that animals and plants are a very small part of that biological tree, and far, far more is this bit that's kind of a bit mysterious to us, bacteria and archaea, which we know very little about, but animals and fungi over here. And the root is the kind of origin of life, however that came about, which we don't know very much about. So here's another diagram of it. This is a bit more tree-like, and here you can see time spans 450 million years, and it's not very clear, but actually up there, that is Charles Darwin. So it's kind of, that's the origin of humankind, very much a small part of the whole. And just to put that in perspective, oh, that's a slide, a rogue smile. This is another way of depicting the kind of all the life that there is on the planet. And you can see up in the top left corner, we have animals, and then we have plants. But actually, it says there, you are here. So we're a very, very small part of all the diversity on life, of life on Earth, which may seem, we may want to pick up on whether that's a problem or not theologically for us in the scheme of things. I would suggest that very least it causes us to be a little humble and to respect the fact that actually we are a small part of life on earth. We may be an important part, we may be the only part of life on earth that has the kind of sentient properties that we experience, but we are still only a very small part. It's a bit like looking up into the night sky with a telescope and feeling that sense of insignificant when you see how many stars there are out there. I think that has the same impression. It can make us feel small. It can also make us feel valued by God because we're here and we believe that we can have relationship with God. Okay, I want now to talk about another myth. That is to say, humans are not descended from chimpanzees, and that's the rhetoric that comes across, that we're descended from monkeys. And you see those kind of cartoons that show that. But actually, yes, in the tree of life, primates become one branch of the tree and different forms of primates divide off. But it's 6 million years ago that human beings had a common ancestor with what became chimpanzees. So it's 6 million years ago that human beings, the precursor of human beings and of chimpanzees were the same, and 6 million years since that line divided. So that doesn't mean we're descended from chimpanzees. Okay, my third, fourth section, I can't remember which is there biology in the Bible? So I've talked about evolutionary biology. It'd be pretty obvious to many that there's not going to be, it wasn't a knowledge of evolutionary biology by the authors of the Bible. They had no knowledge. This is something that's only been with us for about the last 150 years or so. So they're not writing from the framework of the understanding of science that we have, just as there isn't, nuclear physics in the Bible, so also there isn't evolutionary biology in the Bible. But I'd like to suggest that there is an understanding of biology in the Bible, and I'd like to explore that a little bit and the ways in which we find that in the Bible, because I think it's important to realise that understanding of the world we live in has been a gradual process of gathering knowledge, and we heard a little bit about that from James Hannam yesterday. But I'd like to suggest it goes back before even the early church or the medieval period, because actually I think in the Bible, in the Old Testament, written sort of 2,500 years ago, there was a real interest in understanding the world around, and a real sense in which we wanted to know about it, they wanted to understand it, and they observed it. So here's my first illustration of that, and this is about King Solomon, very famous for his wisdom. His wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the East and all the wisdom of Egypt. But also it seems that he was really interested in natural history. He would speak of trees, from the cedar to the hyssop. He would speak of animals and birds and reptiles and fish. So he was perhaps a natural historian in the making. He was interested in knowing how things work and why. We have not much more to go on about him than this, but it seems that he was known for his appreciation of nature. The second thing I notice in the Old Testament is the sense that the authors really wanted to classify different kinds of life. And Cheryl touched on this, but in the Genesis account we read that God made the wild animals of the earth of every kind, and the cattle of every kind, and everything that creeps upon the ground of every kind. So there's that awareness that there are different kinds of things, that everything is not the same, and that actually you understand different things in different ways. The awareness of difference and of diversity. But it goes further than that, because I think that you can see a sense of what I call broad groupings coming in by habitat. So here we have the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and every living thing that moves upon the earth. So these are different categories of living things according to the habitat, the niche, the ecological niche, if I were to use modern language, that they inhabit. And that actually is it's slightly different in different parts of the text. So here's another one. We've got the animals of the earth, the birds of the air, everything that creeps on the ground, and the fish of the sea. Kind of similar kind of idea, but slightly different in the details. You remember the chart I showed you about the modern classification into bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. It's a kind of similar thing in a way. It's this broad classification. Now, we can't read the one onto the other. We mustn't collapse the two together, because one is a modern classification, and we can't suggest that the modern classifications are going to fit exactly onto the ancient. For one thing, the ancient world had no real knowledge of bacteria and anything microscopic because they didn't have microscopes. But the impetus, it seems to me, to sort and to name and to categorize is part of human experience. It arises from language development, and I'd suggest in the biblical context it arises from an understanding that this is God's world, that he is the creator, and that there is some desire to understand the handiwork of the one that they worship. So, here's another example, and another one. And these are all slightly different, and actually in my PhD research I looked at all of these, and I never found one single place where these classifications happened that was exactly identical. They were all slightly different, which suggests to me that it's not a kind of a totally kind of fixed, and it has this little bit of fluidity. Okay, let's think a little bit more about detail of classification, and these come from the legal texts of the Old Testament, which are describing what foods are clean and unclean. But you notice here that it's physiological characteristics that separate out the species. It's physiological things. It's the divided or cleft hoof is one characteristic, and chews the cud. And those, of course, are now biological taxonomic classifications that we recognise. So the cleft hoof is called the Artiodactyla order. It's a major group of herbivorous mammals, so deer, cattle, goats, sheep, and so on. And those that chew the cud are called ruminantia, and that's a suborder of Artiodactyla. So divided hoof and chewing the cud, that enables an identification, and it's an easy identification because these are recognisable characteristics. And so at the bottom it reads, the pig, even though it has divided hoofs and is cleft-footed, it does not chew the cud, so it's unclean. So there's that separation out there. And here's another example. Winged insects that walk on all fours are detestable to you, but among the winged insects that walk on all fours, you may eat those that have jointed legs above their feet with which to leap on the ground. And of course that's locusts and crickets and so on. So really interesting, this focusing in on the details. I just wanted to, haven't got time to spend on this, but one of the things we also notice when we read the Old Testament is that it's very rich attention to what we would call ecological habitats. Now, they didn't use those terms, but actually I'm drawing on a book by Daniel Hillel called The Natural History of the Bible, which is great read. He's a Jewish ecologist, but he uses his knowledge of the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, and his childhood growing up actually in Palestine before the creation of the state, to an exploration of the landscape there, to divide and explain how there are all these different kind of habitats that you find both in the land of Israel itself, in the land itself, but also referred to in the biblical text. And this sense that the people that lived in the land really had an awareness of the different habitats, the different landscapes that were there and that they were part of their lives. I'm going to move a little bit to think about some ecological connections in the text, and I'm unashamedly using the triangle again. I'm going to focus on kind of ecological habitat, if you like, natural world and humanity, the relationship between human beings and the natural world, the sort of more biological understanding of that. But of course, as Cheryl pointed out, this is a theocentric framework, and so we have God as the overarching framework for it all. And the first text I want us to look at, is one that Cheryl also had up, which is Psalm 104. But the thing I want to highlight here is the idea that in this psalm, it's perfectly natural that everything should have its place, its ecological niche, but also the ways that animals survive that might seem slightly, we might be surprised at, it doesn't seem to be a problem. So the issue of predation and prey, the issue of animals killing other animals for food is not a problem to this author. It seems perfectly natural for him that young lions should roar for their prey, and they should seek their prey and eat other animals. And some people have argued that the theory of evolution is a problem for Christians because of the fact that animals are predators and some animals are prey. But it seems even in the psalm that was not a problem. The issue of predation, it was seen as just a part of the natural order. The other thing I've noticed is this incredible attention to detail. And I'm going here to the book of Job again because there's an extended discourse there about that. But the thing that really struck me was the level of biological detail that is given. So here we have detail about reproduction, and this is all done as rhetoric. It's a rhetorical challenge in the mouth of God to Job, who has complained about his unjust suffering. And this says, do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Do you observe the calving of the deer? Do you know how many months they gestate for? Do you know when they give birth? And the implication behind this, because the Christian tradition, Jewish tradition, is very much that these texts have a human author who's working with the Spirit of God, but it is the human author as well. I see clearly from this that the human author understood these things, that he observed these things. He was writing out of his observation rather than making up something that he didn't know anything about. So this attention to detail is both an indication of the Bible's interest in these details and also the author's interest in the natural world, that this was part and parcel of his own agenda. And then here's another example. The ostrich. The ostrich wings flap wildly, its pinions lack plumage, it leaves its eggs to the earth and lets them be warmed on the ground. And again, the behaviour of an ostrich or various other animals in this section are very detailed descriptions of how they behave. Now, there's another part which talks about the ostrich being rather stupid because it abandons its eggs, says that verse, to be trampled underfoot. And I thought that was a bit strange, and I came across a really interesting article by a zoologist who'd investigated the behaviours of, no, it wasn't ostriches, whatever is in South Africa. Is it ostriches? Are they ostrich? Does anyone know ostriches in South Africa? It's not emu. Emu's Australian, so it's ostriches in South Africa. And he discovered that actually you can get the appearance that an ostrich abandons its eggs because ostrich behaviour is an ostrich will lay its egg in a hollow in the ground, and then another ostrich will come along a few weeks later or a few days later and lay its egg, and so they have a cluster of eggs. But when the first chick hatches, the mother of that chick will take it off to feed, so it appears that the mother has abandoned the other eggs. So I thought that was really interesting, and this guy was making suggesting that this text in Job that talks about the ostrich abandoning its eggs was actually an observation of that very behaviour. So I thought that was really interesting. Here's another one. Under the lotus plant it lies, in the covert of the reeds and in the marsh. This is this is the hippopotamus, and then the eagle, of course, mounting up and making its nest on high, living on the rocks. So this observation, this attention to detail, is something that suggests that the Bible is interested in not just human beings, but in biology as a whole. And it makes me very happy because I love nature and natural things. Let's think a little bit more briefly about theology, and my time is nearly up, I realise, and biology. We've already seen these things about the natural world, revealing something of God, worshipping God, having intrinsic value. A couple of other points about the natural world. We read in places like Jeremiah 12 that the natural world mourns over human wickedness, that the human sinfulness causes nature to mourn or to grieve or to lament. And I think that's something that is quite relevant for us in today's world. And also that the natural world rises up against injustice. In Amos, the injustice against the poor causes the earth, the land, to be disturbed and to tremble. Another couple of examples. In Isaiah 1 and Jeremiah 8, animals are held up as examples of good behaviour compared to human beings who are not. So in Jeremiah it says, even the stork in the heavens knows her times, the turtle dove, swallow and crane keep the time of their coming, i.e. migration time, but my people do not know the decrees of the Lord. So animals are seen as a positive role model. We have examples of the natural world involved in the story of the life of Christ. In his birth, you have a star from the east, in his temptation, his miracles, his death. The natural world is evolved in all of those. And Cheryl has already talked about the eschatological vision for a renewed natural world. And again, this is featured in Cheryl's talk, so I'm not going to focus on it. Human beings, part of the system, made in the image of God, but servants of the natural world. Just a shameless plug, if you want to know any more on that, there is a little book I wrote on the bookstall which goes into it in more detail. But I want to end by two quotes that kind of go full circle, if you like, and pick up a little bit where we left off. And these are both from North American Christians in the evangelical tradition, and it is the conservative evangelical tradition that has been outspoken against kind of being able to reconcile the Bible with science. And these are two, I would say, well-respected Christian authors from that tradition, one from Canada and one from the States. And this is somebody called Jim Packer, who's at Regent College, Vancouver, or was until he retired. And he says this on the relationship between the Bible and science. Biblical references to nature and history, so far as from being scientific in the modern technical sense, are simply declarations, naive, phenomenal and non-technical, about God in relation to the world. And they are expressed in such concepts of nature as contemporary culture provided. And then the second one, and this is from a church pastor, a very well-known church pastor in the States. And he says this is the tragedy he sees. I've seen too many young people in too many churches exposed to bad science, shoddy thinking, false claims, and the misguided idea, maybe well intended, but misguided, that somebody was defending the Bible when what they were really defending was a wrong interpretation of the Bible. Then I've watched when very often those really bright young people go off and pursue education, go to college, begin to read, and discover they were misinformed. Then they think you have to choose. They have to choose between the Bible and truth. You don't. And the follow-up to that, of course, is a real concern among these churches, that when young people think they have to choose, actually what they choose is modern, the modern world rather than their faith. And I've met many actually young people and slightly older people who, when faced with this stark dichotomy, actually chose to reject what they thought was the truth and just embrace science and become agnostic or atheist. So, thanks very much. Thanks for listening.
Great, thanks, Hilary. Who has a question? Do we have someone with a mic?
Tell it's getting to the end of a long weekend.
Yeah, not so much a question, rather an addition. You have mentioned in your talk White and Draper. That's perhaps a bit Anglo-centric because in the English-speaking world, these were the two persons who brought forth that conflict myth. But on the international level, it were rather the German materialists Büchner and Vogt and Haeckel, who had a great impact in the Islamic world, for example, or also in Russia. And yeah, just a remark, when I see these quotations, there are real cases for that, and several times on the occasion of this event we have mentioned Ron Numbers, who was raised as a member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and he studied, I think, at Berkeley geology, and he tells when you attend a conference with him that one day he was together with two other members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and they discussed all of that, what happened, what they have learned, and then they renounced their faith. So things like that happen, and that's the background.
Thank you. Yeah, no, thank you very much. Really helpful.
Bruno has a question.
Hilary, I'd like to reflect on what you said in the previous talk about the issue of identity. I think that it seems that the conflict lies beyond the scientific explanations, beyond the culture. It's about, or as a social group, who I am and who we are as either a religious community or a scientific community, and then or a person. And then when I'm exposed to the idea of evolution, or when I start to engage in scientific inquiry, I realize I have to negotiate my identity. And I think that's far deeper to address this issue than simply come with information. Because it seems to me that to the level of outreach or to the level of informed communities, and to avoid this sort of reaction of people renouncing their faith or taking uninformed decisions based on narrative. I think from what had been exposed by about the relationship Quran and evolution, the Bible evolution, that identity issues are at the core. And the question is how can we address it, that take into account not only the cognitive level but the emotional involvement of people with it, and our social relation. I think that I don't know how to address this, I'm just raising, but I think that's a core issue, identity. And identity community, the identity of the communities are pretty much involved in reassessing their understandings of science and faith.
No, I think that's absolutely right, and I think that the socially constructed kind of context can either be really positive and open to new ideas and conversations and so on, or they can be very much bounded by, and so often they are in religious contexts, bounded by very strong walls that may or may not be part of the kind of core non-negotiables of that faith tradition. I mean, I would say that when it comes to things that we've been talking about this weekend, that these are not identity markers for whether things like the theory of evolution and whether you are subscribed to it or not is not an identity marker as to whether someone is Christian or not, in the way that first slide I showed seemed to indicate that there are some fundamentals that define what Christian faith is, but that's not one of them, which means that in theory at least, somebody who's a young earth creationist and someone who's an evolutionary biologist and both Christian can kind of worship together and pray together, and I know examples of many people that do, and that's great. What I think, my sense is that what is not always there and needs to be there is spaces where these things can be aired. And I know many people who are not able to talk about this issue in their church because they're not sure what other people think, and they're not sure if they express their views whether they'd be marginalized a little bit or regarded as being a little bit suspect or whatever. So I mean, I don't know how you go about it, but the way to create open spaces for dialogue, it seems to me, is absolutely crucial, and perhaps we can all help be part of that.
Question here.
Question and a comment. I'll start with a comment. In agreement with the pastor from, I think, in America. I come from Uganda, a developing world, where some people, because of ignorance and lack of knowledge of scientific facts, somehow abandon their science skill because they don't want to threaten their faith. And so, especially in our secondary schools, we get some students who say they don't want to do biology, they don't want to become engineers, because then they don't want to abandon their faith. So I think information like this needs to spread beyond the developed world.
Absolutely, I agree with you.
And then my question, you did mention that, I think there is a slide that you had that was showing that 6 million years ago, there was that branch from which human beings separated from the origin of, I think, the rest of the animal species, or the monkeys, or something like that. How come in the Bible, in Genesis, that is not mentioned? That branch started together, and then somewhere human beings come, and then the animals take this direction.
That's a good question. And first of all, I should clarify that when that dividing, branching happened, it wasn't that you have animals on here and humans on here. What you have is a very gradual distinction between species that would eventually evolve into anatomically modern humans, and species that would eventually evolve into anatomically modern chimpanzees and so on. So it wasn't that at the branching point you have humans, you have species that are slowly become what we call bipedal, in walking on 2 feet instead of 4, change in skull shape, jaw shape, larynx and so on, that mean that eventually you have a species that walks upright, that has a huge brain compared with any other species, which is why we can do all we can do, because compared with other species our brain size is really, really huge, that has a shape to its jaws and larynx that means we can use language in a very, very sophisticated way. So you need all these muscles and bones around here to be different from those of, say, a chimpanzee, to be able to have the sort of language you do. So that is a very, very gradual process that takes place over millions of years. The second thing, to answer the second point of your question, why isn't it in Genesis? I think the answer I give is twofold. One, and the first is really that it's not in Genesis because nobody knew about it in Genesis. So the classifications in Genesis were, broadly speaking, into plants, animals of different kinds, and humans. It's land animals and humans are created on the same day, so obviously there seemed to be some sort of a connection between them. I think that the issue you may be getting at, and I don't know if this is right, is the whole question about what does the theory of evolution do for the idea of Adam and Eve and us being created in the image of God, and how do we reconcile that with the biblical accounts? I think my answer would be that if we try and map the creation account in Genesis onto geological understanding of the age of the earth, we get unstuck, because the two are not, the Bible is not meant to talk about the science, and the fossil record about the age of the earth doesn't talk about theology. And the same, I would say, is true for the creation of human beings. What the Genesis record is saying is that there's a theological purpose to human beings and our relationship with God that is slightly different from that of the animals. And it's making a theological statement. I don't see it as making any sort of a biological statement. And if we try and do biology from the Bible, I think we always come unstuck. We can look for observations and see how they observe nature, but we can't do that sort of evolutionary biology from the Bible. That was all.
Just a small addition. We had a a lecture here by Simon Conway Morris on convergence. He's a professor here of paleontology, and he was showing from his quite intensive studies that in any biological evolution processes that certain organs will actually converge. So species from different sources, he chose not a jellyfish, fish creatures and so on, and humans, that they develop a camera type eye, and it's always very similar. So he did this with a number of converging elements, but his conclusions are that there is some purpose, you can see, some design purpose in a sense. It's a slight overstatement of it, but that the simple scientific principle from evolution being that there is clearly no purpose and direction, it is purely random and chance, but he's making a very big statement scientifically that that's not strictly observably correct, and through this notion of convergence, it's a quite important book and was a very good lecture.
Any other questions? Yes, Roy.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether this is a question or a comment, or probably a combination of both. I mean, how much do you think that this sort of idea of either you're a creationist or you're an evolutionist and so on and so forth, and this whole argument between science and religion is actually sort of deliberately fed and deliberately exploited by the media and politicians for their own ends, and actually statements like this and so on, trying to actually roll back on that, actually show that really it's actually very little to do with religion and very little to do with science, and actually all about politics and the media.
I think you have a point there, and I think that some of the way that the rhetoric is handled, the story is handled, is sort of the modern day equivalent of those two conflict books that are kind of hyping up something. And certainly the media, whether it's television or print media, loves a good clash of identities. They love if they have an interfaith meeting. They love it if they have kind of Christians that will clash with Muslims. What they don't like is when they get together and they actually, we think similarly about this issue or whatever. They love to have conflict. They would rather see conflict, because conflict sells newspapers. It gets people watching, because they love to see people disagreeing with one another. And I think that that what happens is you get led to believe that from the media that all Christians, in this case, are young earth creationists, and all scientists are atheists, and the two, there's no middle ground. But of course what it is really is that there's a very small minority of Christians who are young earth creationists, and there's perhaps a slightly bigger minority, but there are a slightly bigger number of scientists who are atheists, but there are an awful number of scientists who are Christian, and an awful number of Christians, whether they're scientists or not, who don't have any problem with science and evolutionary biology and so on. So you get the narrative of the extremes being seen as the narrative of the whole, which I think is very problematic. Interestingly, Dennis Alexander, who's the founder of the Faraday Institute, when he first began, he kept being asked to go and go on formal debates like with Dawkins and other atheists. And after a bit he came to realise that this was futile. The media like the debate format because it's an argument. You can clash, you can shout, it can get quite heated, and then people have to vote for who was the best. But he actually said after a while he stopped agreeing to do that. He said, I will come to a panel discussion where we answer questions, but I will not come to a formal debate, because I think that formal debate is the wrong kind of forum in which to explore these issues, because people do get quite het up about them if you're not careful, and in that medium they particularly become very confrontational. So he saw that positive dialogue is a much better way of engaging with these issues than the the ones that the media prefer.
Mohammed has a question at the front.
Thank you. If somebody comes and asks me for a medical opinion, I would say I'm not trained as a medical doctor or in that field. I'm trained as an engineer. I could give you some explanation as to some physics, for example, which I've done. Doesn't the same thing apply to this? That lay people talking about evolution, that they are, they have no idea. I mean, isn't this the domain of the biologist? And why is it that only when it comes to evolution that everybody needs to have an opinion? When it comes to medicine or engineering or economics, that people just go about in their business. This is a question for you. Why is that? Why is it?
Why am I talking about evolution when I'm not an evolutionary biologist? Is that what you meant?
Partly, yes.
Okay. I think on the one hand, if someone asks for a definitive verdict, or if someone says, "Am I about?"
It's not a criticism for you.
It's all right. If someone comes to you and says, "My heart's racing. Am I having a heart attack?" you would not presume to answer it. But there are some things where I think we can know things on the basis of good evidence that the scientists we trust. If someone asks me about the science, say, of global warming, the science behind that, well, I'm not a climate scientist, but I talk about it a lot because I give a lot of talks on the environment.
But isn't it based on faith? You put trust in somebody who knows.
But you do that all the time, don't you? If your doctor says you need an operation, how do you know?
It's okay for me, because I've talked to the doctor and I...
Yeah.
Okay, so...
But
anyway.
I think we do that with everything. If there's a public health campaign that says you need to eat more fruit and vegetables, everything we have is based on somebody else's expert opinion.
Yes.
And we have to decide who we trust.
Yes.
The issue is often which voices we trust.
It's based on trust, yeah.
And I think also there are empirical ways of deciding. So if I can shift slightly and use the example of climate science, as was said by Cheryl, I think there are a very small number of climate science change deniers. What happens in the media is they often get as much of a platform as the 99.9% of scientists who actually think there is evidence there. And I have to think, well, which one am I going to trust? The 1% or the 99%? And actually, on balance, I'll go with the one where the consensus of opinion is, because it's done around the world and rigorously. And Cheryl, I think, is itching to come in on that.
I think you've kind of...
Have we missed each other?
I think you've missed each other.
Okay.
I think you're saying, now tell me if I'm wrong, why is it that people listen to people who know nothing about biology pontificating on evolution, like these guys putting all this stuff on the web? Is that what you meant? That sort of... Did I misunderstand you? You said if you're ill, you go to a doctor, you don't ask an engineer.
Yes.
But in this case, it seems to me a lot of people in churches listen to people who know nothing about biology, telling them all about evolution, which they don't really know about. But
also people expect you to have an opinion.
yes, even though it's not your specialisation. Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah,
The point you were making is why are we having this conversation amongst non-specialists, wasn't it?
It's related to
Which
that
is
as well.
which is the question that was posed earlier, which was, is it a political project to stimulate disagreement?
But I'm just wondering if we're talking about evolution and people who may or may not understand it talking about it. I'm wondering if Dawkins and that end of the spectrum agree with the people at the other end of the spectrum, the creationists, that Genesis is saying something literal, because basically they're both saying this, the both ends of the spectrum are saying the same thing about the text. The text is incompatible with science. Do we need to educate people more in how to read Genesis?
Yes, I think I would agree with that.
That probably is a better thing to do
Than have the debate, yes. I think that's right. And I think we have to have discussions around the text that enable people to explore that, because, absolutely.
Brian has a question at the front, and then we'll go to the back.
In what you were covering there, where does the intelligent design movement sit inside the bits you've been doing? I mean, that's again fairly recent, isn't it? I think probably sort of second half of the last century at most. But is that an alternative attempt to is it to trying to bridge, or is it to trying to veer people towards a more creationist view? Where does it fit?
That's a great question. And just a little bit of background. I got muddled about this when I first joined Faraday. The intelligent design movement is in capital I intelligent, capital D design, capital M movement, and it is a particular kind of philosophical framework for exploring these issues. It's not the same as I thought it was, as saying that behind everything there's an intelligent designer, which I think probably Christians and Muslims, we think that God is the one behind it all, and that's part of the theology of creation that all Christians espouse. But the intelligent design movement, yes, was founded sometime in the last 50 years by somebody called Dembski and Bill Johnson, I think it was. And I don't think that they tried to do it as a scientific argument. They were trying not to do it as from a faith-based, although I think they have some of them have faith-based motivations. But what they're basically saying that yes, evolution happens, but in the process of evolution, there are some kind of things that happen that are way too complex to have happened by natural selection. And therefore, at those points, there was a kind of special intervention by the intelligent designer to make something happen. And the example they use, actually, which has already been referred to, is the development of the camera eye. So they said that the camera eye is so complex, it could not possibly have evolved by this process of mutation and selection. Therefore, it must be evidence that a designer has come in at that point in the process. Now, the work of Simon Conway Morris on the camera eye has actually shown that the camera eye evolved at various different points in the history of evolution in branches that were in no way related to one another. So it kind of spontaneously evolved in lots of different contexts, which is well on the way to kind of scuppering that argument, because if something happens in lots of different contexts, it's not that it is so complex it can't possibly evolve. It obviously has evolved. And there are one or two other examples of complexity like that. And the big problem with intelligent design, I find it less coherent even than creationism, it should be said, is that it has a space for God that can get closed up every time you have a new scientific discovery. Every time you discover, you have a bit for God, well, God must have done that bit in the process. But if you discover the science behind that, then immediately you've made God's bit smaller. And my view of it would be rather that, yes, evolution happened, but behind it, the sort of meta overarching narrative behind it is the God of love, the God that Christians and Muslims and Jews worship, who is behind all of this, rather than just doing bits at times and kind of the rest happens outside of God's orbit. So
would you define it then as a sort of God of the gap side?
Absolutely, and that's the tag that's been labelled with, that it's God of the gaps, that there's a gap, so you explain it by adding God in, but then as soon as the gap is closed by medical knowledge or scientific knowledge, God gets smaller. So I think it's very unsatisfactory.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. Yeah, I'm very curious about the education for the public science in the UK. I have been to National History Museum in the London, and also there is a Kew Garden. It's like education for plants.
Yeah.
So I know the founder. It was constructed. The two of them are for public education and a science public education. And I want to know, because the two of them are education for evolution. One is for the National History Museum. We can see the connections of different kind of animals, and the children can see the the phenomena of nature in a different area. Was the climate like, and was the animal same kind of animal? If they live in different place, what do they like? And also I can see the plants were represented.
Yeah.
So my question is, why most of the people say the illusion theory was not easy to be introduced in that society in that moment, but why at the same time quite a lot of friends of Darwin helped her to do a lot of things, to do the public education for this kind of theory. And I know the Kew garden, there are a lot of plants are collected from different area in the world. Are the friends of the same time. Yeah.
I mean, I think that both Kew and the Natural History Museum were founded in the Victorian era, when the real interest in science and public science was growing. And I think that actually, I mean, I don't see a problem with that within the society. I think the society was not seeing that this was a problematic. So, I mean, I think there were people that found evolution problematic in some of the clergy and some of the more established, but the general population, I think, just found this was wonderful, and they loved the idea that they could go and see all of this and enjoy it. So I don't think it was a problem there at all. So, but I think we maybe...
Yes. So what's the background of the society? People can accept the church and church idea, and at the same time this kind of scientific theory.
Can I ask you to follow that up individually, because we've run out of time, and I'm aware that it's people need to get off. So if you could carry on with
have
Hilary.
A conversation.
But thank you very much, Hilary, for an excellent closing session. You join me in thanking her.